Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Eisenstadt. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Military and Security Studies program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And welcome to our event on Rethinking Security Force Assistance in the Middle East. Security Force Assistance, that is efforts to build the capacity of partner and allied militaries, has been a central element of U.S. foreign policy since World War II and has been a vital part of our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan since after 9/11. It's also been something which has occupied the attention of senior decision makers in the military, as evidenced by the creation by the Army of Security Force Assistance Brigades, dedicated units to undertake this mission. However, if you look back at our experience in this area, and especially in the Middle East, our success rate has been mixed at best, with failures seemingly outnumbering successes. And as a result, this is something which I've been giving some thought to in recent years, and actually all of our panelists have devoted a lot of their own time and efforts to writing about as to what we've done in the past and what we need to do in order to institutionalize our own capabilities or to build our own capabilities in this area in order to be more successful in the future. So we decided to hold this event to discuss what we can do and what we are doing in order to improve U.S. performance in this area. So I'm pleased to have this panel of real subject matter experts: Mara Karlin on my left, Jim Dubik, Lieutenant General, retired Jim Dubik in the middle, and Brigadier General promotable Brian Menace at the end, who I understand will be pinning on at the end of this month. So congratulations on your second star, who will be discussing these issues. Okay. Mara Karlin is the Associate Director of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She is author of Building Militaries in Fragile States, Challenges for the United States, which was just published, I think, just a month or two ago. So congratulations on the publication of the book. I've read large parts of it. It's excellent. And thank you for contributing to my understanding of this topic. And we look forward to you continuing to do work on this. She also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development in the Obama administration. So she brings a lot of experience and expertise based on her government service. She also previously worked in OSD, I think, in the Middle East shop as director of the Levant, dealing with Syria, Jordan, Lebanon issues. Lieutenant General James Dubik, retired, U.S. Army retired, is a senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of War and a professor in Georgetown University's Security Studies program. He retired from the U.S. Army in 1928 after more than 35 years of service, including as head of the Multinational Security Transition Command, Iraq, where he oversaw efforts to train, advise, and assist the Iraqi security forces. And I think he'll be talking about his experience there. Jim was commissioned as an infantryman, and he served in the 82nd Airborne, 75th Ranger Regiment, was commander of the 25th Infantry Division as well, and commander of 1st Corps before retiring. So we're delighted to have you here with your wealth of professional experience. And then Brigadier General Brian Menace is Director of Force Management on the U.S. Army staff, where he is the point man for the development of the Security Force Assistance Brigades, which he'll be telling us about in his presentation. He's an infantryman as well, with multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think he also served in Haiti, if I remember correctly. He served also with the 82nd Airborne. 7th ID was, I think, your first assignment, and the 75th Ranger Regiment, as well as working as a planner for Joint Special Operations Command. So with that wealth of experience, and as the point man to discuss these Security Force Assistance Brigades, we're delighted to have you here. So with no further ado, we're going to go into the presentations. I just ask everybody, please turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so already. And you have the option of presenting at the table or here, whichever one you folks prefer. So, oh, and let me just say, I mentioned Mara's publications, and I just, in preparing for this event, I also read some of Jim's stuff here, and I would just strongly endorse. This is Building Security Forces and Ministerial Capacity, Iraq as a Primer. He wrote a number of studies which kind of captured his wisdom after coming back as head of MNSTICI, and they are must-reads for anybody who's interested in security force assistance. So with no further ado, let's get started. Mara, the floor is yours, and whichever you prefer.
Great. I'll stay here if folks don't mind. Thanks so much, Mike, for bringing this terrific group together. I'm delighted to be on the panel, and in particular to see this great audience. You know, I think we have one of those nice moments, as is often the case at Wash Institute, where we have an audience that knows probably as much as we do up here, so we should have a good dialogue. So the United States has this bit of a challenge. You have increased state fragility, right? A proliferation of fragile states who cannot continuously maintain a monopoly on violence, if we get rather academic, as Max Weber would talk about. They cannot do their number one job of creating internal security. And of course, in a post-9/11 environment, this fragility increasingly affects the United States. We see this with just the nature of transnational threats. And our ability to avoid this fragility and what comes out of it is harder and harder. But the United States doesn't really want to deal with these problems ourselves. We don't want to send the U.S. military to go fix the problem for a bunch of reasons. We're sensitive toward casualties, it might cost a lot of money, and if you've read the latest national defense strategy, the U.S. military is trying to focus particularly on high-end competition as it relates to China and Russia, not this sort of thing like helping states secure themselves. So the United States needs to stabilize fragile states cheaply, in blood, in treasure, and time. And it's tried to do this in all sorts of places, particularly since over the last 70 years or so. And what it tries to do is to delegate authority, to go by, with, and through others. So we delegate authority in the hopes that another actor can deal with all of these challenges. There's a bunch of examples where this hasn't worked terribly well. I'll use just one quick one. Imagine Vietnam. So by 1955, the U.S. military becomes quite deeply involved in trying to build the South Vietnamese military as the French leave. And you see a huge amount of assistance run by a fellow named Hanging Sam Williams. It ends up being about $500 million in assistance, a massive program. And yet, South Vietnam's president organizes the military according to his own preferences, which are actually orthogonal to what the White House wants. He has a system based primarily on loyalty. He has totally screwed up command and control. And of course, when the insurgency starts to grow a few years later, it's pretty clear that the U.S. effort to work with the South Vietnamese military failed spectacularly. So I can tell you the monetary costs of that. Let me also talk about the blood costs of that. For the United States, at least, that's 58,000 Americans, right? We lose 58,000 Americans because we can't figure out how to build a military successfully in a fragile state. So in particular in this book, I look at two concepts to help us figure out how do we, at a broad level, more successfully build militaries in fragile states. And I focus on the nature of the American involvement in building the military. What are our parameters, the purpose, and the people? And I also look at the external threat environment. What are sort of antagonistic actors outside of that partner state doing that's unhelpful in terms of offering materiel or sanctuary? And the big finding is, actually, there are two that I'll emphasize. Number one, building a military is, like all state building efforts, a political, not a technical exercise. And we cannot distance from key political issues that waste time, effort, and resources. It is a fundamentally flawed approach, and yet it is the one the United States traditionally focuses on, rather than changing organizational structure, changing personnel, thinking through mission. The other key piece is the United States cannot ignore the role of third parties that are destabilizing. They pose a serious challenge to a newly equipped military. It may not be in their interest, indeed, to have a military that can exert its sovereignty throughout a fragile state. So there are a handful of successes we can point to. One in particular that I talk about in the book is a historic one. It's a U.S. effort to build the Greek military just after World War II. And when I picture Greece at that moment in time, I actually picture what Syria will probably look like in a few years. You've seen profound devastation, starvation, destruction that is, I think, hard for us in many ways to even comprehend. You have more than 300,000 people who died just of starvation. I mean, really substantial, hideous numbers. And effectively, the U.S. approach to building the Greek military is meaningful because it's quite different than what we usually see. First of all, the U.S. military gets extremely deep in effectively mucking about the Greek military's knickers all over the place in terms of the mission. What should the mission be? What is it focused on? In terms of organizational structure, how do you reorganize to actually counter the threat that you need to counter, not the threat perhaps that you want to counter? Personnel. And I'll tell you, this was one that was really shocking to me as I was going through the research. And I say this particularly as a practitioner who has designed a multitude of programs to build militaries. We really mucked around in personnel. We figured out where were the key leadership positions, and we oversaw a complete change in military personnel, from a new chief of staff to changing all of the lieutenant generals in the military except for one, facilitating the promotion and placement of a number of major generals, and pushing out those who did not believe and buy into the strategy. You also saw pretty decent unity of vision among the Americans. Because remember, there's an inside the family story here and an outside the family story. And the inside the family piece is pretty important, right? How well do those actors in Washington actually get along with one another and vis-a-vis those in the field? So in that example, for example, you have a leader of the program who does not actually get along well with the folks around the embassy in Greece, and so he gets booted out. You see a real emphasis by President Truman in making sure all of the interagency actors are actually on the same page. You see a priority put on who is leading the program from Greece. And I will urge you all, when General Menace talks, maybe he can tell us a little bit about how that is related to the Security Force Assistance Brigades. Because we see all sorts of examples throughout history where the U.S. military puts in someone who's not really capable of running the effort. We saw this in Vietnam, where we have someone who was so terrible at his job, he'd actually been demoted previously, and next thing you know, he's running this high-priority effort. We see this in Lebanon in the early 80s, where you have people working to build the Lebanese military who are urging the commander of the Lebanese military to conduct a coup, and others who, once he is pushed out, trying to give him covert weapon supplies. Totally the opposite of what Washington is trying to get you. Moreover, when we look at successes, we see regular assessment from Washington of how well the program is going. Is the program actually meeting its objectives? And under what circumstances do we need to shift what we're trying to do? Might we, under some circumstances, actually need the U.S. military to become a combatant of sorts? Is it that important? You know, there's a great unfortunate example here, of course, with the Marines in Lebanon in the early 1980s. Where they have a pretty fuzzy mission of stabilizations of a presence, where the USS New Jersey is directed to fire against the Syrian military and militias in Lebanon, and yet President Reagan writes in his diary that night, this still falls under the heading of self-defense. Not realizing that the U.S. has become a co-combatant, which ideally would have been a decision taken pretty deliberately. In a more contemporary example, 10 years ago, when Hezbollah takes over large swaths of Beirut, and those of us sitting in the Pentagon receive calls from various Lebanese leaders saying, will you be sending the Marines now? We did not choose to send the Marines then. That shouldn't have been a surprise for anyone, of course, inside Washington, and yet very much was. Our unwillingness and inability to think of our role in a co-combatant way was surprising to them, and that's problematic. And then, of course, you have this external threat environment issue. Who else is mucking about? Who has, outside of that partner state, outside of that binary relationship, who else is trying to make what we're doing a lot harder, and why? In the example of Greece, you see this in particular with Albania and Bulgaria. Obviously, in present circumstances, we see this with the Iranians across all sorts of parts of the Middle East. And a view that, as a former Syrian vice president said, the United States is short of breath, you can always wait them out. So what I've just outlined for you is the way we want to do it, right? Best case scenario, you get involved in all sorts of sensitive issues when working with a partner military. You get deeply involved in organizational structure, in personnel, in leadership. And then within Washington and between Washington and the headquarters, you make sure you have a unity of vision, regular assessments, and an understanding of under what circumstances you might change that all. But that's not always possible. You might actually not get dealt a good hand. You may look at all of this and then look at the partner you're working with and say, that's just a fantasy, right? The partner might think we'll never stop assistance to them. They may think that actually they have a totally different agenda and don't want to listen to us. We may have different priorities vis-a-vis external actors. And that is okay as long as we keep two things in mind. Number one, if we choose to still go forward and work with a partner military, we have to recognize that this is simply limited security sector reform. And you might want to do limited security sector reform. It might help professionalize that military. It might help with gathering intelligence. It might give U.S. military personnel good exposure to what that military is doing and a deep understanding of the region, perhaps. But that's fine as long as we realize that limited security sector reform will have a limited impact. We'll never give them everything they want, and we will never give it to them as quickly as they want. You know, the really spectacular example of this is Lebanon, back when the Lebanese military fought its really big first fight in summer 2007, where the U.S. raises about 40 C-130s or so of assistance, and the Lebanese military and political leadership effectively mocks it. If you watch Lebanese television at the time, you literally saw mocking where folks pretending to be U.S. personnel were handing out puppets and paper airplanes to the Lebanese military. So even under these rare circumstances where you try to move really quickly and everyone's on the same page, it's actually not going to help convince the political military leadership in a country that you're fast enough, that you're giving them everything they want. So under these circumstances, you might conclude with limited security sector reform and say, you know what, that's good enough. It won't fulfill everything we need, but I might get a little bit out of it. Or you might actually say the costs outweigh the benefits here. And in fact, it is better to deal with this problem directly rather than delegating authority. So why don't I wrap there? Thanks.
Thank you. Jim?
All right, so much of what I'm going to say is going to corroborate what Mara just got done talking about. But again, Mike, thanks for inviting me, and thanks all of you for spending your time here. I'm going to tell the story of the Iraqi Security Forces 2007 to about late 2008. I'll leave it at that. In April, May, March of 2007, Operation Together Forward 2 was launched. 2 battalions of the Iraqi army were supposed to come from Mosul to Baghdad. They refused, didn't bother coming at all. Much of the force that did go to Baghdad or was in Baghdad were counterproductive, more than contributory to the goal. And a good amount of the force didn't even fight. In 2008, around March 2008, Operation Charge of the Nights, which had huge problems. And if you want to ask about that, I'd be happy to tell you some funny and some not so funny stories about how we had to pull the Iraqis from the abyss that they created for themselves, but from a growing of the institutional army. It's an interesting operation, because in a matter of 48 hours, the Iraqis maneuvered 3 brigades, one from north of Basra, one from Baghdad, one from Al-Anbar, maneuvered them to Basra, put them under a operational command, and began operations. During the operation, one of the brigades almost fell apart without any really advice from us, the commander of the Joint Iraqi Forces fired the brigade commander. I think he arrested him, actually. Put the battalion commanders in jail, got rid of a bunch of other officers, replaced them all from his school system, pulled the brigade out of Iraq, or out of Basra, put it into the training camp that we had created together outside of Basra, retrained it, added embedded trainers from the 82nd Airborne Division, and 2 weeks later put it back into a fight without any difficulty. So again, the question I asked, what happened between this 1 year? And the answer to that question is really three different stories. The first story is a story of growth, not just in size, though that was important, but size, capability, and confidence. And all three are related. The Iraqi force at May of 2007 was about 380,000. The Iraqi force by March of 2008 was about 560 or 570,000. See, size matters when you can't offset size with quality of leaders, quality of equipment, quality of training. We, in the United States, we offset size with that. We can do with a lesser sized army because we have such good leaders, such great soldiers, such good equipment, such good training, and the good force multipliers. Every helicopter known to man, every UAV known to man, all the best air force on the face of the earth, a logistics system that can move cities across the earth. When you have an army that doesn't have any of that stuff, you offset those deficiencies with size. So size matters. Second is capability. We had to redo the entire training program. And it seemed like initially that the training program, we were reducing it, going from 15 to 10 weeks. But what we did is take out all the white space, so to speak, and all the combat unrelated tasks, condensed it to 10 weeks, and then changed the MO from taking that unit and putting it into the fight right away, take that unit, join it up with its leadership and its embedded trainers, conduct 2 to 3 weeks of special live fire training, and then put it into the battle space with a partner unit so it could continue to learn. So capabilities go up. And last, confidence goes up. Confidence is a very interesting phenomenon. I was trying to capture that on the first slide that on your table, and I think I'll see if I can get it up here. Nope. Can I do it this way? Yeah. There we go. Okay. So confidence is very important. At the tip of the spear, confidence in combat power is a matter of, am I confident in myself, my training, my equipment, my buddies, my leaders, and the systems that are supposed to support me. And it's the last that we sometimes forget about. Look, if I'm a soldier at the tip of the spear, and rare is the case that my supply system can get me the bullets that I need before I run out, my confidence doesn't go up. If my buddy or I are wounded and my medical system can't evacuate me and treat me, my confidence does not go up. If my intelligence system either doesn't tell me where the enemy is or it's always wrong, my confidence does not go up. So in creating confidence, it's not just a matter of training your soldiers and your leaders and your units and giving them equipment that they can have confidence in. It's getting the systems to that support them help. And these systems end at the tip of the spear, but they originate at the far right of the spear's shaft at the Ministry of Defense. And what's depicted there on the ministry's functions are some of what Mara was talking about. When she talked about personnel system, that's acquisition. You acquire people and things. Development, you develop people and things. The force management system is about deciding what size and composition of military you need relative to the threat you have. And the rest of the systems are there. And then those systems that start at the Ministry of Defense slowly go down the shaft through the senior headquarters of the military, through the echelons of command, and end up supporting soldiers at the tip of the spear. So the point is, look, if all you're focusing on the tip of the spear You're not creating a spear. You're creating an entrenching tool or a fingernail file, whatever you want to use it for. But it's not an army. An army needs the shaft. And oh, by the way, the confidence at the tip has to be augmented with confidence, institutional confidence in the government and the senior systems that are supposed to support it, and social political confidence. That is that the prime minister or the president has confidence that his or her army will do what he or she wants. And that the confidence in the soldiers is, I'm not going to be thrown into doing something that's really stupid, this social political confidence. So when you think about growth, I had to think about growth in size, capability, and confidence. And that leads me to really one of the three, the second story, this shift in approach to building an army. The first shift was it's not about training and equipping. It's about an enterprise. It's about the whole spear. It's about using the problems that are created in helping the tip be the best and sharpest tip as possible, using those problems in a B.F. Skinner kind of approach, where those are stimulants to grow better systems. So in our case, the issue was, okay, you're going to grow 7 brigades in the next 4 months. Mr. Minister, General Babakar, Chief of Iraqi Forces, what's your plan to buy the equipment so that it's ready when the brigades are? What's your plan to select the battalion or brigade commanders, company commanders, and marry them up at the right time? What's your plan to where are they going to go, and how is where are they going to go linked to the campaign plan for the counteroffensive? So it's not you solve the problems for them, but you use the problems to not just come to some near-term solutions, but to build institutional and ministerial capacity at the same time. So we got out of train and equip, focus on the tip, to enterprise, focus on the whole spear. The second shift was a shift from focusing on our job as the transition command to focusing on our job on contributing to security. And if we improve security, transition will take care of itself. So that was a big shift, and I try to capture that on the second slide a little bit, because we had to do a couple things differently in the 2007 and 8 period. First, I literally subordinated my command, Minsticky, to Ray Odierno's Corps, Multinational Corps Iraq, in the sense that he determined the priorities, he and General Babakar. When they were constructing the campaign plan for the counteroffensive, they knew they would tell me when they wanted their forces, at what time, date and month, and what capability. That became our priority. Prior to that, Minsticky had one set of priorities. Multinational Corps had a second, really didn't work very well.
Jim, if you could just forward it once so the people
one more.
watching
Oh, yeah,
could
okay.
See the slide.
How'd that work? Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that was the first shift. The second shift was to look at how we merged what advisory and training effort we had in the schoolhouse with what embedded trainers we had that Ray owned, not me, embedded in the units, and then how would they be partnered with units? Because an army isn't like a bass fishing contest where you train them once and release them into the battlefield. Training is continuous. So we had to set up a system where the embedded trainers in all aspects of combat support, combat service support, were continually the training of the units that we trained in the schoolhouse, and they were trained as they were partnered with units. So this business of going from security to helping contribute to security was a second big shift. And the third was one from an argument about, well, are you building a quality army or building a quantity army? That, to us, became a stupid argument. Because if you're aimed at the quality army, by the time you build a quality army, quality defined as U.S. or NATO standards, the war's over and you lost. If you only train the quantity, then their performance on a battlefield will be so bad you're going to lose. So the issue became what's sufficient right now, and we went through a process of defining minimum equipment and minimum leadership requirements to field units so that they would fit into the way the Iraqis wanted to lead, and then built a schoolhouse that had a continual iterative improvement. You know, the United States Army in 1986 was pretty high quality. It was way better in 1990. It was way better in 1995. It's even better than that now. Quality is not an absolute characteristic. It's an iterative characteristic, and it's a relative characteristic. These guys had to be good enough to beat the enemy that was in front of them. Not even that. They had to be good enough to beat the residual enemy that was left after the counteroffensive that Odierno put in place. So those were the three shifts. The shift from training equipped to enterprise, the shift from transition to security, and the shift from quality or quantity to sufficiency. And the third story that I would say that accounted for the improvement from 2007 to 8 is a story of the beginning of permanent effects. Now I have to go back to the first slide, so I hope I can do that. Yeah. When we decided the long-term approach that we would be in, is that we would shrink Minsticky from the tip of the spear to the right as you're looking at it. That we would be able to start thinning out the embedded trainers, but as we did that, we wanted to retain the embedded advisors at the institutional and ministerial level, because those were the long-term, that was going to produce long-term effects. And we started to do that 2010. 2011, we decided as a nation to do exactly the opposite. We built an Office of Security and Cooperation that was focused almost exclusively on the tip, and gave it the capacity to do that. And that decision, plus several really bad decisions by the Prime Minister, eroded a whole bunch of forward momentum that we had. So my claim is in the 7 and 8 period in Iraq, we didn't have everything right. I could probably spend the entire afternoon laughing with you about the things that were wrong, and being sad with you about the other things that went wrong. But there was also a move in the right direction during this period. And it corroborates much of what Mara writes in her book as an example of why train and equip is not a sufficient approach to take. It's necessary, but not a sufficient approach to take. Now, what happened after 2011? Well, that's a fourth story, and I'll be happy to answer your questions later on about that story, because that's as interesting as the first part. So, Mike, over to you.
General Menace.
Sure. Well, first, I got to say I'm thrilled to be here. Really learning more about Mara, with General Dubik, you know, from a young officer watching what was happening in the big team down at the bottom. I'm impressed to hear, sir, your perspective, so thank you. And I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share a little bit about where the Army thinks it's going now. To begin with, I'm very impressed by what Mara talks about, to start with why. And, you know, I don't think we could be more in harmony with that question. My experience, I learned a ton during a 15-month deployment to Afghanistan during the surge. So we started surge 2007, right at the beginning of 7. We were destined to go to a northern province in Afghanistan, and when I arrived, I was told I was going to be the theater tactical force, which meant I was moving to Kandahar because we were going to plus from only at the time 1 brigade, believe it or not, to 2 brigades. We were the 2nd brigade. They extended the brigade that was there, and they designated our team, the battalion I led at the time, to be the theater tactical force. So what that is at the time, we weren't sure. Brian, go down and help the NATO partners. Yes, sir. So I show up to Kandahar, and they start putting us to work to go fix things in provinces with the Brits, the Dutch, Romanians, etc., which gave me a phenomenal opportunity to travel around the country for months at a time with a lot of people with guns. Why I say that's important, because I had access to the communities. And I got an opportunity to speak with Afghans, you know, much to the chagrin of my soldiers. You know, every time I saw an Afghan, we'd stop and talk to him or her, or him. Mostly. All. And, you know, get a chance to just sit down and ask them how life was, what their equities were, you know, who owned the land you're on, who you're farming for, you know, and from that perspective, I learned a ton. And it was also interesting that with me at the time, we'd like to have Afghan security forces with us. and certainly be very interested, as I was often facilitating the dialogue, but how the Afghan security forces related to the population that was right there in front of us. And I was often shocked at what that relationship was and how distant in most cases it was, and what their equities were for security force folks based on what the people's equity were, like what they wanted from life and what they thought their security forces should provide for them. And so I learned during that 15 months, which almost daily I had an opportunity to speak with Afghans. And that's different than the people sometimes that are in leadership positions. It's a very, very nuanced thing. And so I'm struck by what Mara's talking about is then she says, certainly security force development is not a technical thing, but I certainly think it would fit in if harmonized with the right why, correct? Because as General Dubik talked about, there is an intimacy that needs to be, an expertise technically, as he's describing, to create a security force to accomplish that why. I guess a cynic would say, important to know why, but probably more important from a managerial and leadership perspective is the how, correct? How do you create this great army or security force that is required, in harmony, you would hope, with our national political goals, our foreign policy goals, and, of course, our partner security goals. Hopefully those partner security goals are generally well received by the population they're serving, correct? And I suggest that I think General Milley, who about a year and a half ago recognized that we certainly should continue to try to professionalize the way we conduct security force assistance. Over the years, just to describe how it was done, at the time in 2007, I was leading a parachute infantry battalion. We were stood up in 2006. So in 6 months, we were asked to stand up the unit, train it for combined arms, be combined arms capable, and then transition yourself to a COIN task force in 6 months. And then deploy for a region up in the north, which we tried to desperately invest in what was happening in the north, to, hey, Brian, now you're moving down to the south to work with the folks there, which is a completely different environment. And so what we found was all of us were adapting very rapidly and somewhat capably to what was in front of us. So General Milley was a part of that with General Dubik and others. And so what he saw was an opportunity now is theoretically we and his army, our army, needed to transition to prepare ourselves for high-end combat by the signals, particularly several years ago when the Russians started showing themselves as a serious threat to our allies. What he recognized is his army, our army, your army, is the only one capable of fighting that fight, where security force assistance, he thought, certainly an important task, but we need to prepare for that. Now, the National Command Strategy, the National Defense Strategy also outlines, Secretary Mattis, that a very strong pillar still for the military is growing partner capacity. So the fortunate vision about a year and a half ago, General Milley says, hey, right now, the way we're sending brigade combat teams forward is inefficient, meaning we train them at a great deal of money to be combat ready for high-end warfare, and then we sort of set them aside, potentially rip them apart, restructure them, and go forward to accomplish a security force assistance task. What he recognized, it was inefficient in that he wanted to preserve the combat readiness for the unknown, for the fight that we had to primarily be prepared with, and he thought that it was unfair to our partners and our units to then only spend a very small fraction of their life cycle preparing for what really, and oftentimes, is very dangerous work, right? Is partnering intimately with our friends who are in combat. So we started a motion to create these Security Force Assistance Brigades, which was going to augment the Special Operations Forces that are already a very high op tempo, meaning we have got them working pretty much as hard as they can. And because of that, we have focused our special forces upon mostly our partner special forces. So the high-end folks in Afghanistan and Iraq are intimately partnered with generally our special operations forces. So again, we knew we needed a capacity increase. We knew we would want to do a quality increase. So General Milley had this vision of organizing a unit that would have a form that would fit the function. So he theorized creating advisor teams under a brigade combat team structure, with basically just the leaders. So we would have sergeants and above who were second-time folks. We hoped self-actualized in their basic tasks, who could be brought to this unit after they had successfully served as a combat leader and another, who understand combat, who understand a lot of what General Dubik had described, form up a team. We would give them adequate lead time and only focus on those tasks, not high-end combat, but solely on partnering with the unit. We would project giving them enough time to study the environment, to learn about their culture, to understand why that military existed, to learn some language, primarily to understand the culture better, frankly, but also to be able to break the ice, start negotiations, more effectively work with a negotiator, and such. So we created this organization. Secretary Mattis, on his first visit to theater, went to Afghanistan and Iraq. During the time we were conducting our attacks into Mosul with our partners in Iraq, he saw an intimate partner relationship with our units, with the Iraqis, doing a very, very good job. When he was in Afghanistan, because of the requirements that we have there, we weren't able to go down to a partner level, intimate partner level, to enable and accompany in combat that needed to be fulfilled. So General Mattis asked General Milley to see if he could accelerate the program of developing the Security Force Assistance Brigades. So we did a lot of work over a period of about 7 months to create this brigade, get it organized, trained, equipped, and and it's currently serving in Afghanistan on its maiden deployment. The team's about 816 people by design. It's a 12-person advisor team, 4 primary advisors who are basically maneuver folks, infantry, armor, and then enablers, fires people who can help with fires control, integration of intel assets, communications, et cetera. So we've tried to increase our quality through this deliberate process that we hope fits better into our security force assistance apparatus. As I suggested, additionally, we hope to save our combat readiness of our maneuver brigades by sending SFABs forward to do security force assistance regionally rather than sending brigade combat teams. So those brigade combat teams, because even it's more efficient. The last thing is that in a time of crisis, we have to, and the boss always has in his mind, expansibility. So if we get into a crisis, we now have, at the end of this, 5 regular Army units that can expand because they're already structured with sort of a brigade combat team task organization. So theoretically, we just got to fill soldiers. The chain of command is already there, ready to train and receive equipment if we're called to do so. So that's the current approach to meet our security force assistance requirements and that mandate. I think the vision for what Clausewitz would say is imperative for us, he would suggest, and I'm no expert by any means, I'm not going to quote him directly, but he says, hey, General, you have to understand the peace you hope to create before you go ahead and fight that war. And I believe also, as I was in Joint Special Operations Command at the beginning of Iraq, the question I had immediately as we started studying this is what happens after what was somewhat academic, the fact that we were going to have the ability to dislocate Saddam Hussein's forces. Not that it wasn't extremely difficult, heroic, but it's essentially what was going to happen the day after. And we were very interested in, well, what are we going to do with the guys that are currently holding the rifles, and how do we and should we incorporate them into the future of Iraq, as they are Iraqis, correct? And so what I watch in Afghanistan is a similar challenge. Many of the people that have guns that are opposing us are actually Afghans. And so you have to ask, okay, what's the future that we would hope, we're quite certain will include them? And so then we're here in the middle, because every day, in that task force that I was a part of in 2007 and 2008, every day I had to try with my folks, with the help of the locals, with the help of my guidance from higher, with the help of direction of a government that maybe the people didn't necessarily trust, try to figure out what to do and who to do it with. And that's a very, very difficult thing if there's not a clear roadmap. Now, I'm not naive to think in a very complex situation you're going to have a clear roadmap. And I think, back in the day, I was like, man, I wish somebody would tell me what to do. But I realize now that I hope I would have an opportunity to collaborate with what we would need to do. because of the expertise maybe that we have with the environment. So I think I'll close with that, sir, if you don't mind, and then allow time for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. General Menace has to leave at 1:40, I understand. So what we're going to do is front-load questions to General Menace first so that we could make sure that those who want to ask him questions have that opportunity, and then we'll broaden the discussion. But it looks like we have plenty of time, so thank you all for being brief. But if I could just start to get things rolling, if I could ask you if I could try to draw you out a little bit more about the program of instruction that's used for training foreign militaries. Is it basically kind of a version of the same program of instruction we would use for our own troops? Or how is it tailored to deal with perhaps different challenges? For instance, we assume close to universal literacy. That's not always an issue. That's not always a fact in many of the armies we train. So how do you deal with that? And likewise, issues at different military, you talk about culture, but there's also different military cultures. We, in our military, for instance, we always want to grow, we have a very strong NCO corps. Mm-hmm. And when we go overseas, we always, and I hear this all the time, we want to build a strong NCO corps in foreign militaries. But first of all, I asked the question, might the environment not necessarily conducive to doing that because of cultural issues and the like? And is that the only model? Because there are some very successful militaries. I mean, the Soviet military, the Israeli military, although the Israelis will say they would like to have a strong NCO corps, but it doesn't work with other aspects of their model. So are there other ways that we could, how are we doing it, and do we allow for perhaps different templates or different kind of models for building military depending on the circumstances of the partner military that we're dealing with? So.
Great question, sir. I think, so start with what might be the issues. So we've designed a military advisor training academy at Fort Benning. From the lessons learned, we tried to assemble a program instructions and education for our advisors on understanding what their role is. We have a certain expectation that they are technically and tactically competent in the base military schools. Again, call it how to communicate effectively, how to conduct medical care, at least in our image. So then we have to help educate them on an understanding of what the Army we're going to help, or the security force we're going to help, could be or should be. So great point. You can't have an NCO corps, at least my belief, unless you have a very high quality soldier to draw from. So and even in the British Army, the top NCOs are called warrant officers, technicians essentially. And what we find is America, thanks to your support and the support of our community, send us very good people. Of course, we pay a lot of money for that, with the all-volunteer hour. And we invest a huge amount of energy in the education and development of our NCO corps. Again, that is a force management, that is a big team decision to invest in that because, again, we know how valuable that is. As you suggest, countries that don't have an educational base, where you have a very strong population to choose from, it's very difficult to suggest that you're going to have a conscript come in who has a low, potentially IQ education level, thought about, honor and what he's going to be in life, and then expect him to be involved very rapidly into a person that you can subordinate through a theory called mission command, meaning just provide instructions and allow him or her to go out and accomplish your intent without a huge amount of effort. So what you brought to our attention, Mike, is you're right. We cannot create, I won't even use the word create. We cannot help influence an Army to look like us if it can't look like us or shouldn't look like us. And so back to the very good thoughts that General Milley was having when we started this process is we had to have folks who were self-actualized enough to start asking those questions, who are humble enough to suggest and patient enough to suggest that we shouldn't necessarily be working by, with, and through to accomplish our mission, which is very nuanced as well. I hear the term by, with, and through sometimes, hey, we're going to use the Afghans to accomplish our mission. I almost suggest it's by, with, and through to accomplish their mission. So is it really by, with, and through, or is it just being a partner? Is it just being someone who can train, advise, and assist? And I've gone through many episodes in the Army. We had this great human train team development. We had these military training advisors come that were all sort of piecemeal efforts, not professionally developed, long-term commands that would again, professionalize this task. And General Milley had the vision to start this, and with the help of another exceptional organizer, General Anderson, who's the G3 for the Army, in a very short time, create this structure, create this, these units and an opportunity for us to advance security force assistance. But sir, that's, I think you're all over it. We can't start with, hey, they need to look like us. And so that's a very good point.
Thank you. This is, I have a few people. If you want to ask a question of the general, please raise your hand. I got Mike Kraft, but again, just for General Menace right now, because he has to leave shortly. So we have a question over here. Let me just, where's the mic? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, General. I have one question that maybe Ms. Karlin can also answer later, and then a specific one for you. The first question is on the relationship, if any, with the civil affairs units. What kind of relationship do you have? Do they play much of a role in training and backing up? And second, a more specific question. You mentioned you wish you had a roadmap. Well, before we went into Iraq, there was an interagency team of about 100 people, State Department, agency, and others. I was not involved. I was in State, but knew a little bit about it. And we were told that Secretary Rumsfeld did not distribute it to many units, so some managed to get a hold of it. And this is supposed to be a roadmap of how to deal with the locals afterwards. Did any of this seep down to your level? Were you aware of any of that?
I think broadly, yes. But the question was how well, and you know, there's some exceptional folks working on it, so I'm not suggesting that there was any sort of expectation of clarity. But even what a Ba'athist was, for example, you know, it wasn't until I was in Baghdad working with the community members about where we were going to go, and this is early, right after the initial, our initial operations in the area, to discover what a Ba'athist really was. You know, who along that Ba'athist chain, from a school teacher, nurse, doctor, anybody in administration, in the government, the people running actually the power plant were Ba'athists, and then for us to categorize them all as enemy, you know, certainly at the time I was questioning. Particularly when they turned to myself, I was a brigade executive officer, 2IC, for a unit in the south of Baghdad that had a power plant. And the power plant was not functioning properly. And they turned to me and said, Brian, we need to get the plant online. I said, wow, that's interesting. So I went to the neighborhood to try to investigate who could help us run the power plant, right? Who could come back to work, because they were desperately afraid of coming back to work because of the specter being detained and sent off to Abu Ghraib or elsewhere. To the point I had to send a lieutenant. There was an Italian plant, power plant. I had to send a lieutenant to Italy, to the plant designers, to get the instructions on how to run the power plant, and we brought him back. So in the middle of all that stuff, our neighborhood security, we were trying to administer a government and run the power plant. Back to your point, it never trickled down to us to say, hey, here's a roadmap to establish relationships with the community members we think will lead us into the future. You know, who's right, who's wrong, which party's good, which party's bad. That, you know, certainly I wouldn't expect, you know, some sort of clairvoyant vision to come down, but at the same token, again, right, as I just suggested for us on the ground, who's good, who's bad, who's the future of this country? You know, we were sort of extrapolating that by local neighborhoods, right? And by the people that were willing to speak with us or work with us. And so I guess to answer your question, so I really respect the work that we had started, but, you know, for us at certain levels, you know, there wasn't any specific roadmap.
What about dealing with the looting problem?
No, so again, yeah, so the looting problem, the question is, how, you know, were you given a roadmap and the looting problem? Nothing besides stop it, you know, and clearly we empathize with that, but, you know, how do we get into the middle of something? You know, how much violence, or force should you impose to stop somebody from stealing the window frame out of a building? You know, as you know, you use lethal force to do that? No, we didn't think, certainly not, right? And so, again, we were desperate to say, well, who of their security force, who of their local leadership would want it to stop that could help us make it stop? And so, again, that was a very difficult place to be in, right? You're sitting there watching these things, and then, you know, figuring out how to help was very difficult. Where we tried to help was when you saw violence against people on people. We tried to step in and make sure that folks had some space that way, or if somebody was hurt, we tried to help them. But it was a very difficult situation to watch there. And then have presence just to avoid people from doing it if we could.
Okay, Jim Shear.
Yes, hello. Jim Shear, RAND Corporation. Thank you all very much, and my apologies for a late arrival. Two specific questions for General Menace. Number one, how modular is the SFAB entity? You talked about a team of 12 advisors, but what's the tooth to tail there, and does that really create issues for going into conflict-affected countries where we may not already have a fairly big footprint on the ground? And secondly, is there a role at all for civil works training? If you look throughout the MENA North Africa region, there are some countries, I would say Senegal, for example, l'Armée Nation, where they very specifically have their armies playing a role in national development. That would create some issues for our own interagency, USAID, but armies do contribute to that, and it helps to build civil support. So those two questions.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. I'm going to back up to the direct question. The civil affairs, we've solicited support from both the history of what we've done, and the Special Operations Command is assisting us with developing our programs of instruction, our educational venues for our advisors. So indirectly we are getting a lot of help from the Civil Affairs team and U.S. Special Operations Command. So where we go to work is dependent on where we need to grow partner capacity. So right now, the emphasis is on the Middle East. The vision of the Chief of Staff is to create as many of these that the theaters would advise us, direct us on where they need help. So we'd have an intimate relationship between a brigade commander who is told early in its life cycle, hey, we're going to need you to focus on a certain region of the globe, let's say Africa in the future. And then we would correspond with both the special operations groups that are already working there, the interagency that are working there, and the military advisors to include State Departments about what was needed. So we get a vector on, particularly in Africa because it's language specific, correct? So we'd like to focus early in the life cycle of a unit on where they're going to operate and what purpose they'll serve. And so over time, what General Milley sees is this task not going away, as was discussed earlier by Mike and others, and that we need to professionalize this, and he hopes to establish the structure that could do just that. For example, a unit would be designated early in its life cycle. You know, he gets back from one deployment, and he gets vectored on, let's call it 4 states in Africa, if that was an illustrative example. We would try to understand the problems, the roles of the security forces there, what is required, and then develop a scenario to help advise to those tasks. And so the vision that we have is exceptional. You know, certainly the challenge we have with current affairs, certainly the challenges with our partners in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, as we build these organizations, we think we have to accommodate the intimacy there first because that's the priority. And again, our hope is to alleviate the stress on the brigade combat teams that are getting ready for high-end affairs so we can set them aside and do this great task for the Army. So General Milley's vision is to be able to be more productive in many different areas by our design. The size of it, I probably should have said, you talked about the size of the team, so tooth to tail. We are very lean on the traditional brigade combat team enablers. For example, we don't have our organic security. So we built it to focus on the internal advisor, and based on where it would go, whether it was doing more, as you described, a civil affairs type of thing or building infrastructure, things like that, we'd need very little security. We'd have, of course, our advisors have small arms to protect themselves, have the great support of the theater as they go someplace. If they're into Afghanistan right now, then we're having to augment that unit with security forces. Now, the intimacy of the security forces, squads are being developed by the teams that are developing those squads. Advisors are doing that. We marry up about 3 months prior, get intimate with how we're going to operate, and then go collectively as a team. And so, again, we did not want to commit a large amount of resources to that brigade, but he's got us very focused on the teeth of the advisor mission, and we will augment it with support based on the environment they find themselves. The vision, again, if it was a high-end support of one of our interagency partners, instead of an infantry squad, I might have a team of USA advisors with us, as an example.
Okay, Doug Ollivant here. And actually, I'll tell you what, we're going to piggyback just Doug and then Mark, if you could piggyback your questions.
Sure. Brian, great to see you again. Sure. I'm glad Mara brought up the quality problem. That's been a consistent theme in our security force assistance programs. For those of us who saw the transition teams in the 06 to 08 periods, there were occasional points of light, but certainly not 1,000 points of light among those teams. What we seem to have solved this. General Abrams, when he was Colonel Abrams, my chief of staff, once told me that, Doug, nothing in the Army matters until a BCT does it. Well, now we've had BCTs doing security force assistance for 2.5, almost 3 years, and it's become important to the Army. But as you transition this mission to these new SFAB, Security Force Assistance Brigades, SFAB, is that how you're saying it?
Yes, sir.
Are you confident that you can maintain the type of quality control that you got out of a normal BCT? You CSL leaders, CSL intelligence officers embedded in those formations when you stripped them. Now, I know Scott Jackson, he's great, I know his team, but having a unit like this is contrary to the Army's DNA. This is not, and we've seen attempts to do this before. We've seen, Army good ideas that then fade away as the bureaucracy takes over. How confident are you that Scott Jackson's successor 2 iterations from now is going to have the same type of quality on his SFAB that Scott has on his?
Yeah, great.
And if I could just ask Mark very quickly, if you could, right over here, right now, yeah.
Yeah, listen, I spend all my time in Baghdad. I just got back. I work on the equip side of the train and equip. You haven't talked about the equip side. While we can get the SFABs on the ground quickly, we have a pretty good idea of the equipment that they're going to be needing. Trucks, Humvees, personal equipment, NVDs, intel capabilities. As you're working this SFAB development, are you working with our security assistance organizations, USASAC, DSCA, so on and so forth, to accelerate their acquisition processes so that we can get not only the people on the ground to start doing the training, but get the proper equipment on the ground to start doing the training generally at the same time?
Right. I'll start with your question first, sir. So the intersection of what we do and what the ministerial support teams do from the theater teams, I think there's a line there. You're describing, as General Dubik described, a bigger force management process that right now the Security Force Assistance Brigades are not necessarily equipped to do or prepared to do. So we're sort of taking it, not sort of, we're taking it from core maneuver down. We have a vision of creating 2 security force assistance divisions and corps that would do the bonding from the advisor teams at the corps level, let's say, of the Afghan Army up. So then create folks that would be more in tune with the the intimate force management issues that would have to be created and or enhanced, accelerated to support the Army that our advisors are working with. And so right now, that's still what we believe from General Nicholson is that he's happy with where that's going, because that's where he's had a lot of focus. But where he is thankful for help provided by these teams is more intimate, dedicated advisor and accompany missions to where they need it. So even where these folks are going are at the design of the Afghan security forces where they think they need help. So there was a lot of collaboration that took place in a very short time about, when they should even arrive. So they decided to arrive them in March because that's where the sort of peak military operations start, March through November. We have a unit there to help, and again, back to augment the support that we're doing ministerially, whether it's putting in new helicopters, sir, to support, new vehicle support, et cetera. And so I think that's where, we still, at the Security Force Assistance Brigade, has a break from a ministerial role, I would suggest, but General Milley has a vision to do that with the development of Security Force Assistance divisions and corps, as if we continue to grow and have the end strength to support it. So he's intersecting that with also growing, combat capabilities in his force to meet the threat that the Russians are posing, if that answers your question. And sir, the question again from your perspective is?
Maintaining quality.
Maintaining quality. Thank you. So the MTTs, the teams that we had I won't say ad hoc, but we would put them together and suggest to those leaders, hey, you're going to be a command designee. And we'd appoint these folks. They'd have 15, 20 people. They'd go to a shake and bake course, JRTC, some very fine education in a very short time. They'd arrive to generally support other organizations. As a BCT, a Brigade Combat Team Commander, an MTT would arrive to me. And, you know, I was always first very inquisitive about where they stood from an IQ of what was needed in the theater. And so the force recognized for promotion and other things that if you didn't lead a combat unit, you didn't get promoted. And so it really chopped at the knees anyone of quality, theoretically, volunteering for one of these positions. So one of General Milley's primary initiatives in this was to make sure that the people we brought would be successfully, a success militarily in our organization post a tour with the Security Force Assistance Brigade. So each of the leaders in this organization are already successful in their key developmental position. So all the captains in this organization that are advisors have already led a company successfully, are in the top 50%, and we're reasonably sure they're going to be promoted and successful in the future. 2 reasons. 1, because we want him or her to be self-actualized, so he can partner well. And 2, we want this to be successful culturally. Additionally, we have given it its own identity. We've created a special regiment. They have their own beret, so distinctive unit identification, and patches, which was different than we did in the previous endeavors, where we didn't create permanence with structure. So we believe, sir, that this will last or outlast General Milley's stay, particularly as it's being well received by our theater, the combatant commanders who desire this quality in its force. So General Milley had that on his mind as he created it. He didn't want to be in a flash in a pan. He didn't want to penalize Scott Jackson, who he believes is a good candidate to be a senior leader in his organization, by going off to the SFAB. Our selection boards wouldn't recognize him as a combat leader doing great stuff. But there's such a buzz with the permanence of this that I'm quite confident that his vision is going to sustain this for some time to come.
Do you have time for one quick question? I think we're going to also, if the other panelists are okay, push this a few minutes over so we could have Andrew, you're the last question.
All right, great. Thank you, sir. My name is Andrew Swick. I'm a researcher at the Center for New American Security. You touched on this a little bit, but one of the main criticisms I've heard, of course, is that SFABs are essentially conducting the missions of Army Special Forces with less training than the green beret. Is this solely a capacity problem within RSOF, and has there been any interest or ability to expand the capacity within RSOF specifically? And then real quick, have there been any friction points in staffing MOSs within the SFABs?
So the first question is, certainly from a foreign internal defense and unconventional warfare, there's a subset of security force assistance. So our SOF teammates can do a large variety of things. We think we fit a niche below what they offer. We think that the added emphasis on a command accomplishing the security force assistance issues that we think are complementary to what's happening with SOF, that we are further enabling the partners to develop. We know that there's a demand for us to go help our partners. That was being accomplished by brigade combat teams and other combat units. We acknowledge that we are not going to get them, the Security Force Assistance Brigade members, to the same level of understanding of fit affairs as our SFAB. But we believe economically it's a good balance between the investment we need to raise a soft special operations soldier to a conventional person that gets what we believe is adequate development in this field to go serve that purpose. And so that is the design. So we're very happy. We think we're filling a niche. We think we're going to, as I suggested, meet something with a cheaper, more economical, and something that has form to function. The MOSs, military occupational specialties, to find the people that we need, they have to be volunteers. And so we are in a campaign to inform folks about this opportunity, and then we allow the leadership of each of the organizations to screen and assess the folks. They have to be in the top 80% of fitness. They have to be in the top 75% of the reports, meaning they're a very strong candidate in their field. They have to be completely deployable. They have to be no discipline problems, and they have to be evaluated as suited to the task by their chain of command. So even before they can go to a physical board and a short assessment, which physically takes place in front of the commands, you know, they are screened. That is a challenge for us to, and it was a terrific effort by General Abrams and others to offer up his force for volunteers to come out, and then for the Training and Doctrine Command to backfill those people with, you know, other inexperienced leaders that then need to be developed by the units that sent us their volunteers. So from a force management perspective, General Anderson's been pushing us to try to figure out how to build these Security Force Assistance Brigades while maintaining the rest of the force development, the force management. So it's been a great effort. We do see some challenges getting the numbers of the special MOSs that are already of high demand to be selected, vetted, trained, and brought to us at a volunteer level. So yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Mike, it was
really,
a pleasure.
No,
I'm sorry, and I have to apologize for monopolizing this.
Well, I think, like I said, I think we're going to push it a little, so we'll have time. But thank you very much. Thank you for your service, and best wishes for success with this initiative.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay.
Can I start by commenting on a couple of things?
Yeah, actually, that'd be great. Actually, why don't you just jump in? I had a few questions for each of you, and then we're going to open it up. But if you want to just jump on in, that's absolutely fine.
Two of the questions that came up, one by Mark Kimmett on equipment and yours on NCOs. Look, creating an NCO Corps is an institutional responsibility, not a unit responsibility. Mm-hmm. That's number one. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to get an NCO Corps produced by this solution. Second, the Iraqis, for sure, and I think the Afghans too, wanted to create an NCO Corps. So it wasn't something that we came and said, we are Americans, we have great NCOs, which we do, therefore you must have them. No. They looked and saw this is a great capacity that we want to have built. So if that's true, you don't do a shake and bake solution. Didn't work in Vietnam with us, not going to work with them. So you create an institutional capacity to select the right soldiers, to train them in the right iterative way, because a buck sergeant needs only X amount of training, a staff sergeant, Y amount of training, a sergeant first class, Z amount of training. So that's, again, an institutional requirement that is built into a personnel system that can then select, promote, and assign a person. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to get a solution like that if the requirement is, and many countries want our NCO Corps. Yeah. If that's the requirement, you don't get it by sharpening the tip of the spear. Mm-hmm. You get it by developing the right institutional capacity on the shaft. Mm-hmm. Same thing with equipment. You know, Mark's comment on equipment is exactly right. Now, I wish he'd stay, because part of our equipment problem is our own system. But I won't put that. I'll put that aside, because that's a whole nother deal. But if you want to have a system in an indigenous army in a fragile state, you have to build an institutional capacity to identify the right set of equipment, to make a reasonable choice of what they want, to match that up with the money available from their own Ministry of Finance, to purchase it in far enough in advance, and then marry it up with a training program once received. That is not an SFAB solution. Right. Now, I love SFABs. I'm glad that General Milley set them up. They're absolutely necessary. This is a good, but it's not sufficient in itself. And this is why when you look at building armies in fragile states, you must look beyond the tip of the spear. You must focus attention on the shaft, or you'll get temporary self-gratification without any permanency to your efforts.
Okay.
I just want to jump in. I could not agree more with Jim's comments. I think we heard a whole lot of tactical and operational solutions. That's great. It is necessary. It is far, far from sufficient. I'd also caution all of us against anchoring too much to Iraq and Afghanistan. Remember, these are places the U.S. military has been fighting wars for about 16 or so years. Arguably, at this stage, the U.S. military has a pretty decent understanding of the dynamics there, although I think we can probably all think of examples where that may not be the case. But look, every day the U.S. military is working with partner militaries around the world, more than 100 different places. So there's a danger of looking at the places that we've been involved in for a decade and a half, that we had a pretty substantial at various moments occupation of these countries. That's not going to be replicable in just about any other example that we'll look to.
Thank you.
And this is why, in terms of my own handouts, Mara and I, might as well be brother and sister talking about this stuff. Why I think is understanding what an army is before you go trying to advise and assist it. An army is not a bunch of guys good with their guns. An army is a political instrument that operates on behalf of a political community that is built and reflects that political community. So if you don't understand what an army is to begin with, and its components that make up an army, the entire sphere, then you're not going to come to a solution except mirroring what you know. And I can't say enough about the importance of knowing the nature of the problem you're trying to solve before you arrive at solutions.
Okay. Thank you both. Great comments. I'd like to just draw you both out a little bit more based on your comments in your presentations and stuff you said right now. First, for Mara, in your book, you said that success in security force assistance often comes when the U.S. becomes deeply involved in the military affairs of the host country in terms of personnel selection, organizational issues, and also when it is able to prevent or deter meddling neighbors from undermining the efforts, the security force efforts in the country of concern. Now, both of those are political heavy lifts, okay, require sustained attention over time, okay. On the other hand, if you look at the Middle East, we've been retrenching in recent years. We've gone towards a kind of a light footprint approach, rebalance towards Asia Pacific. Russia, China, Korea are problems today that we didn't have to deal with 5 or 10 years ago and that are diverting the attention of policymakers, resources and attention and the like. So let me ask, is there a kind of a contradiction here or a potential conflict that success requires sustained political heavy lifting, but yet in the Middle East we're trying to disengage and we're focusing on increasingly on other parts of the world. Can we square that circle, or is that only an apparent contradiction and that won't necessarily stop us from achieving success? Let me just also ask Jim, which is kind of a follow-on to this. I mean, one of the major, and we talked about this right before the event, one of the main reasons we were successful when you were there is that we had a really excellent Paul Mill team in the form of, Ambassador Ryan Crocker and General David Petraeus, who would constantly, would put the full court press on Prime Minister Maliki in order to do the things that Mara writes about in terms of firing certain officers and promoting others. And so I want to ask, does there need to be a State Department, an analog to the SFABs, or say, at least in maybe not in terms of an organization, but in terms of an effort, that you always have to have, whenever we send an SFAB, there needs to be also a complementary diplomatic effort to support what they're doing. And therefore, should there be a State Department piece or an initiative at state that kind of, complements this effort? Or, whether it's organizational or simply just kind of a, part of their mission. So anyhow, I'd like to hear your comments on both of these, please. Thank you.
Great, thank you. My guess is our comments may bleed into each other with those questions. To start off, of course, we have the Churchillian problem of democracy just being a pretty problematic system. Every 4 years, and kind of on the margins of each of those, every 4 years there's a question of what are our priorities and where are we going to focus. I do think you need sustained political involvement, and I do think that can be a heavy lift. But it must not have to be. You could have capable people at the right level who understand the issue they're dealing with and are able to continually assess it in a way that makes sense. So it really, to me, it comes down to the who. And I don't think the who has to be all 4 stars or senior executives or cabinet level members whatsoever. I do think it does need to be a very capable person both in uniform and a very capable person on the civilian side. I mean, you had talked about kind of one of those dream teams that we've seen at different moments. Right now you look at U.S. embassies across the Middle East, and I think you have 1 full-time ambassador or so. That's probably not ideal. You probably want, rather than a defenestrated State Department, one with kind of actual, substantial, robust knowledge at a number of different levels, people who've spent time. Because what will happen if you don't is that we will turn exactly just to Brigadier General Menace. And The Defense Department has some really good answers, particularly at that tactical operational level, but they cannot and they should not do this themselves. It is not their comparative advantage. So I think it is possible if you have the right folks both sitting with a civilian hat and a uniformed hat, but that often doesn't actually happen.
Okay.
You know, leverage off that last statement. I don't think the State Department has to create SFABs, comma D.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to imply that.
What I do think is that if you're going to send in some military organization to do security force assistance, then you must have a corresponding issuance of instructions to the ambassador on the diplomatic responsibilities to reinforce the military activities. And you have to have similar instructions to the military to make sure that what they're going to do is consistent with the instruction to the ambassador. And then the third leg of that effort is the institutional capacity, which is military and civilian. Look, when you go into some minister of defense, regardless of what country it is, and I'm a senior captain, it's very nice, here's your seat, but there's no influence going on. You must be a relatively senior, experienced person in that kind of function. Whether it's military or civilian, it is immaterial. But the Deputy Minister of Finance in a Ministry of Defense wants someone of his or her stature to give that person advice. That's not going to come out of an SFAB. Yeah. So the effort is a diplomatic effort, maybe not an organizational solution, but certainly instructional solutions. It's an institutional effort, and it's a tactical effort. Those all have to be blended together. What a surprise. Tactics, operations, and strategy levels have to be aligned towards some goal.
And I'll have one more question that I want to open it up, so I apologize and thanks for your patience, but and we're going to be extending this a few minutes after, and I hope that's not an imposition for you folks. Very often, regional militias have often punched way above their weight in dealing with regional armies. And I think part of the secret sauce is that in trying to create a regular military, very often, in the Middle East, just like us, they take people from all over the society and they try to create a band of brothers through training. But very often, militias start with bands of brothers, literally, very often. They are cousins and family members and people who grew up in the same neighborhood, and that gives the units very often cohesion and motivation that maybe is missing in some of the regular formations and maybe is part of their ability to punch above their weight. So is there a way, is this something that maybe we should think about, and is there a way to perhaps take some of the militia DNA and kind of inject it into the regular militaries, the way that, in Britain you have kind of the regimental system, which is different. It's locally based, and it's not necessarily based on family or clan, but it is creating esprit through common sense of, heraldry and common, geographic origins. Is there something, should we be thinking of along those lines, or is that contrary to what we're trying to accomplish in many of these countries? I'd just be interested in hearing your thoughts on this.
It seems to me the interests are just so profoundly different. The nice thing with working with a violent non-state actor that doesn't care about a government that is responsible to its people or care about sectarianism is, of course they can be really effective in doing that sort of thing. Hezbollah is not terribly worried about how it might upset the balance of consociationalism in Lebanon. Well, that's great. I can do a lot better if I'm only focused, on making sure you have a whole lot of arms and, know how to use them. So I think the interests are just utterly skewed.
Yeah, I can't add anything more to that.
Okay.
There might be some societies in which militias make sense in some kind of military structure, but
not militias per se, but the model of kind of creating basic primary units from people from the same neighborhoods.
When one of my predecessors in Iraq, Dave Petraeus, started the Minstiki effort, that was exactly the kind of approach. We're going to have local forces.
Yeah.
And it works very good in some ways, but then when you ask them to say, okay, well, we need to reinforce you out of area X to area Y, hey, sorry, I didn't sign up for that army.
Yeah,
all of a sudden, you got a different problem. Yeah. So it's a very unique societal and country-specific problem.
Okay, great. So look, we're opening up to questions here. Please just raise your hand. Let me start right here in the middle, and then Mark had some questions. So can we get a mic to the gentleman in the middle here, and then Doug again? Okay. Right here in the middle with the tan jacket, please.
And while you were out, Mark, I provided another answer to the equipment thing. So.
Thanks for both of your presentations. I don't know if this is on. Oh, there we go. I found myself nodding in violent agreement for listening to both of you talk about the need for intervention on the right side of your chart, General Dubik. In the institutional area. My question is around how the defense enterprise broadly organizes itself for that mission, because I think, as you point out, the Security Force Assistance Brigades are not built for that. Most military sergeants or captains or the personnel that we have available to send into these missions know very little about the functions at the strategic level that you list on the right side of your chart.
You can go up the chain of command.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you get further up the chain, there's less likelihood that you're going to be able to send a senior officer into some far-flung country and embed them for 6 months while they shoulder to shoulder train a deputy finance minister. Also, the lion's share of that kind of expertise lies on the civilian side. But the Pentagon civilians, they know the PPBE system very well for fiscal management, but I don't think we want to translate that into, the Ministry of Defense in Botswana or something, right? Yeah. And so, the question becomes, how should the Pentagon, the defense enterprise, organize itself to be able to fulfill that very critical function of intervening at the institutional level, given its resources?
Yeah, I think ad hocery might be the right answer in this kind of case, because you're going to want to pick specific kinds of skills, and at the skills of finance, the skills of running large personnel systems, running large maintenance systems, logistics systems, these kinds of skills reside in the Pentagon and in senior headquarters. And in each of these cases, the Pentagon and senior headquarters, it's a mix of civil and military. So I don't think it's the case that we don't have the pool of appropriate skills and experience. The problem is more identifying that skill and experience and moving that person from where he or she is through some kind of a minor training program into a team effort, and then deploying that person. The motor program that the Secretary of Defense's office put in place was, in fact, an attempt to do this, and they had some successes and some failures. But in large, I think the breadth of the civil workforce and senior military workforce has the skill and experience necessary. Where we don't have the skill and experience is in micro selection, and then moving that person to the right place. And maybe we can develop that skill. But first, you have to recognize that it's a problem we have to solve. And if you define the problem as a tactical security force assistance problem, mm-hmm. you're never going to solve the problem you identify. So our first issue is look at what you're trying to do, understand the problem in its entirety, and find the right sets of solutions that may differ depending on where you are from tip to hilt of the spear.
Okay, right here in the middle, Mark Emmett.
Micro-selection is great.
What's that?
Two questions. The first one is, we took a completely different attitude towards train and equip in Iraq since the rise of ISIS coming into the country versus what we did in the 2004 to 2011 time period. Yeah. Are there any lessons we're learning from that? And the second question is, Ryan Zinke is our Secretary of the Interior. We don't have the concept of ministries of interior or interior forces. Right. In fact, most of the work is being done in these countries by the interior ministries. Are we making the right decision to bring the MOD model into the ministries of interior? Yeah. Do we understand the difference, because we don't have the cultural background of the difference between internal defense and external defense?
You want to start?
Sure. So absolutely spot on, Mark, of course, about how differently we chose to counter ISIS. And I think we're starting to see some of the repercussions. There was a period of time in which you saw all of these marriages of convenience to focus on countering ISIS. And now that I think we step back, we can see that there are some real costs to that. So, for example, if you look at who overwhelmingly was behind the various kind of military defeats, used in quotes, of ISIS, it was oftentimes militia types, right? Violent non-state actors. There were pieces of the Iraqi military, like the counterterrorism service, but just pieces. Generally, if you're sitting around Iraq, you're not feeling like it was your military that was there for you during this hard time. And so I think this actually makes things a whole lot more complicated going forward, because there was a period of time in which we could say, no, your military will deliver for you. Really, it will. And now we have actually the case study where not only hasn't it, but instead a multiplicity of violent non-state actors actually largely has.
And federal police units out of the Ministry of Interior.
Absolutely. And so that was a different approach. I mean, it does come down to how much do you prioritize ISIS and how cognizant are you that there's a cost to trying to fight ISIS. Obviously, Syria has its own case studies along those lines. On the interior security force problem, I remember with Afghanistan early on, we said the Italians would be in charge of thinking about these issues because they have Carabinieri and so they've got this. And that didn't seem to terribly work so well. You do have this challenge that many of these militaries in the Middle East in particular do play an internal defense role, whether or not they want to acknowledge it. They may like the sort of splashy, sexy role of actually saying they're fighting an external actor, but we know at the end of the day, their priority and what their government expects from them is to be able to exert sovereignty throughout their territory. I think what I don't know that we have a different, there's no kind of model in the United States beyond DOD to actually play the role here. So at best, what you can do is actually have those conversations with whomever that security sector is. What is their no-kidding mission and what are they trying to get done? And from all of that should flow how we actually assist them.
So to answer your first question on lessons learned, Mark, I think the lesson that we should not have been surprised to learn is if we want to sharpen the tip of the spear, we're really good at that. And we did sharpen the tip, and it did help defeat ISIS in Iraq, not completely, but pretty substantially, in conjunction with the militias and other forces. So that should be no surprise. What we have not done is any permanent improvement in the ministerial capacity of the force or the institutional capacity of the force. So our positive effects will be temporary. I don't know how long they're going to last, but they're going to be temporary. The second question on interior, this was a big problem for me because, I had both, the interior and defense. And I wrote about the interior part in this monograph for Institute for the Study of War, creating police and law enforcement systems. What I found the approach that at least was pragmatic, whether it's the right one or not, they'll leave to other people to assess, but at least a pragmatic, was to acknowledge that at the ministerial level, the functions of the Minister of Defense and Interior were relatively the same. The Minister of Interior had to figure out what kind of his force management problem was, how many local police, how many provincial police, how many national police, what were going to be the mix, but he had a force management problem. He had a personnel problem. He had an equipment problem. He had a distribution problem. So the functions remained pretty much constant. The systems were different. And on the first slide that I gave you, the second box from the left echelons of command, these were the military systems. But in the monograph that Mike referred to, Iraqi security forces, I talked about the police systems, and this is where we differ. The police systems were patrolling, investigations, forensics, apprehension, incarceration, adjudication, logistics, facilities, leadership, and internal affairs. And so the sphere of the character of the police sphere, the interior sphere, was of a different character because the systems were different. But you still had to connect the tip, the police, the local police, to the Ministry of Defense through those systems and through those institutions. They were just different. And so that's the approach that we had taken. There is a huge shortcoming, as you referred to, in the United States' ability to do this, because our police systems are bottom up. The police chief in Erie, Pennsylvania, and the police chief in Bowie, Maryland, they're damn near independent actors. They can set the standards for themselves as they want. There's no centralized promotion system. There's no centralized standardization systems for training. The state police in Virginia and the state police in Utah are not joined by some national police standard system. So we have a very decentralized, separate system. And when you go into most of these countries, they have exactly the opposite. So we have a great way to bring in police chiefs from some country or for some city or county from around the United States, but that person has no clue how to aggregate their experience to the national or provincial level. They have no clue that they're setting up a national police system. This is why bringing in the Carabinieri was so important to us in October of 2007. You know, they helped develop this approach that I'm talking about with the Ministry of Interior. They have a national police system, as do several other countries, so it's not just the Italians. And so we can pick from that. I don't know what the solution is. I'm part of a group out of the U.S. Institute of Peace and a couple others that are trying to figure this out. But the solution is not us to create this capacity. We're never going to do that because it doesn't match our culture and history. But we've got to figure out some conceptual way to come at this problem.
Very quickly, please, but I just want to.
The Ministry of Interior does have responsibility the day the military force moves on. They are responsible for law enforcement. They're responsible for local order. And one of the things that we're seeing in Iraq right now is that all those hard-won gains in Ramadi and north, in some ways, are being frittering away because the police forces that we haven't focused on and the coalition hasn't focused on are not necessarily up to standard. And so we just got to, unless we always fight as a coalition and bring in the Guardia Civil or the Carabinieri, we've got to figure this out.
Yeah, we got to figure it out. I'll use Bakuba as an example. So in the counteroffensive that Odierno put together, the Bakuba was cleared by a Stryker brigade and a brigade from the 1st Cavalry Division. And after clearance was done, sometime during the hold period, he wanted me to produce a brigade in the 5th Division to replace the Stryker brigade. And at the same time, I was working with the Minister of Defense and the Provincial Director of Police to recruit and train an initial set of police forces that could take over those. So in the 3rd monograph, so I'm here selling the Institute for the Study of War, Operational Art and Counterinsurgency, it talks about the requirement of blending these activities together into a coherent campaign plan. Again, but if you define the problem as train and equip the tip of the spear of the military, you're not going to look at the full coherent set of solutions required. So we have defined the problem to match what we want to do. I'm sorry to say that. We want to solve the problem by sending in the best military in the world to sharpen tips of spears. They are great at that. But it's not going to be any kind of permanent solution or even semi-permanent solution unless you get these other parts of the security equation put together.
If I could, we have 2 more questions. I'm going to ask it to do it together. So piggyback, just be very succinct and ask the question, and then if we could ask the panelists to give succinct answers, I'm going to wrap it up. So thank you.
Okay, Mar, I have 2 very quick questions on politics, which you said at the beginning. And I want to congratulate you on using defenestrated correctly in a sentence, by the way. I've never heard someone do that before. Politics, we can look at macro and micro. And I'll use Iraq as is the case I'm most familiar with. In the 2006 to 8 period we're talking about, we never wanted exactly what the Iraqis wanted. We wanted more or less the same things, but we were always 20 degrees or so off. Whereas in the 14 to 16 period, we wanted exactly what they wanted. And therefore, I think this explains the great success, at least at the tactical level of that campaign. So how do you assess when you have a close enough fit that it makes sense? And then just very quickly, the metal task of most armies for these fragile states is conduct a coup. And that's something that we never talk about because No, commit it usually. So how do we find this? I mean, when Maliki did his preemptive coup proofing in 2012 and dismissed half the Iraqi army generals, I went back to the guys who were working this in 10-11, said, what did you do to convince Maliki this army wasn't a threat? And I got very, very blank stares. How do we get our people doing this to understand that the military is a political tool in these countries and not just an instrument of military power?
And Mike Kraft, very quickly, please, and then we'll wrap it up.
So far, nobody's mentioned what I think is the big elephant, the problem of corruption and sectarianism and sometimes tribal issues. The theory of soft power and nation building doesn't seem to be very popular these days, at least with this administration. But how do you get about improving the armies when you have a whole society problem? Do you see any major role for trying to do more in that area? Justice Department in some countries tries to build up the judicial system, but do you see any solutions to tackle, especially in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan that are so deeply involved in corruption?
Okay, thank you. Telegraphically,
In 30 seconds or fewer for both. Okay, so I'll take your second, the second question first. Look, ideally, everything we're talking about is one piece of a much broader state-building puzzle. The challenge, of course, is oftentimes countries are really excited to work with our militaries and not terribly excited to have us muck around in their judicial system. When I had designed this program to build the Lebanese military, there were two thrusts to U.S. efforts with Lebanon. One was we were going to work with their military. The other was that we were going to try for the very first time in Lebanese history, actually hold someone accountable for an assassination. This had been the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri. That investigation is literally still going on now. Since I can't even tell you how many years. It's more than 10 years that this is happening. So I think the best case is A, recognize that countries are often less excited about us getting involved in other pieces of state building. However, B, that is crucial because the last thing you want is a totally weak state except for one institution, which happens to be the guys with the guns. That's a really dangerous long-term problem. So then, C, what you would do is you would try to use this as a leverage. You would say, because of our work with your military, we know you care about that. We know you care about that relationship. Therefore, hey, Poland, we're really concerned about your bill on how people can't talk about the Holocaust, right? It should allow you to muck about in other things because they care about that relationship. But you have to be willing to actually use it then. Quickly turning to Doug's really good questions, I think the way you know if you're close enough, frankly, is having those honest and transparent conversations. So often when we are with partners, we self-censor ourselves. We don't actually try to figure out what are they thinking and why are they thinking it, and where are their actual lines. And because of our reluctance to figure out those lines, we sometimes all just sort of smile and put a sheen on and think we're closer than we ever really are, and not recognize where those kind of, is it one standard deviation or 7? On the coup, when you were speaking, I was thinking of both sort of the over coup and then the sort of, I don't know the great term of thinking about this, but sort of the coup whereby the head of the military just takes over a political position, like we saw in Lebanon, kind of a few different examples where only the head of the military could really be the president, which I think is pretty unhealthy for the system. I think part of it is that we need to make sure that whomever is working with this partner military gets that the political leadership, particularly in these circumstances, is justifiably really nervous. They're concerned. We're generally working with these sorts of militaries at very worrisome moments, right, where the political leadership is looking around, looking behind kind of every corner and saying, who's after me, who's trying to stab me? Which means we have to acknowledge to folks across the military, particularly in leadership, we expect you to do certain things, and our relationship will be tied to you acting in a responsible manner, and it will be cut off if that is not the case.
Jim, you got the last word.
Well, I won't answer Doug's questions because they were too hard. I'm glad Mara answered his on the corruption business. I think we have to lower our expectations. I think we're crazy. I mean, look at our own police and judicial system. Compare 1850 to 1950. Compare 1950 to now. Is corruption gone? No. The answer is no. Is there some iterative improvement? Absolutely yes. So I think if we make non-corruption the entry-level position, we'll stay home. And if we expect in 2 or 3 years to eliminate corruption that's taken decades, perhaps centuries of cultural history, I think we're crazy. But there are a couple of examples that I'll give you from my experience in Iraq. After the Jones Commission finished its great report on the Iraqi security forces, I went to the Minister of Interior, Minister Balani, and said, and General Hussein, the Chief of National Police, said, look, you guys are in trouble. This report tells me that you're such a corrupt regime, I can't spend U.S. money on you. I forget the name of the act. Some of you guys might know what it is, but there's an act that says I can't spend money on militias. And as you guys are a militia, you're not a real police force. Shortly thereafter, the Chief of Iraqi National Police fired both division commanders, all 9 of his brigade commanders, and 14 of 28 battalion commanders, and replaced them and then fired a couple others. So there are ways to get at beginning the step toward corruption, getting at corruption, but there's not a hand wave thing. The Minister of Interior, and just in the 15 months or 14 months that I was there were 13 assassination attempts on the Ministry of Interior Internal Affairs Chief. I counted that as a great, though gruesome, indicator, that he was really trying to clean things up. So these things you just got to keep at it. There's not much more I can say about it.
Well, I just want to, on that note, I just want to thank both Mara and Jim. Thank you very much for excellent presentations and for enlightening us about an issue that's going to be very important. It's been important, and it's going to be even more important in the future. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.